Hello again, Buckeye Nation. It's time for the Silver Bullets podcast. Been a couple weeks. I am rejuvenated, fresh off of the boat. Just come back from a nice week-long Disney cruise. Had a holiday. I am Michael Citro, by the way.
And I am Chip Minnich.
And Chip, how was your holiday?
It was wonderful. We're fortunate up here in Ohio that where I'm recording from. Family on both sides is relatively close by, so we didn't have to, travel too far, because I know that can be one of those things that adds to the stress of the holiday season. And as we mentioned on the last podcast, the Minnich family, we also engage in Festivus as well. So the airing of grievances, the feats of strength, all that took place prior to Christmas, and that went well also.
Did you win the feats of strength?
I say that I do, because in my defense, I guess, if you want to follow, like, any sane, rational married man would say that their wife is the head of the household, because she basically calls the shots. But of course, like in Festivus lore, Frank Costanza, he had to be pinned. So I always take it upon myself to wrestle 3 children. It was a heck of a lot easier when they were, underfoot, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But to actually have 3 teenagers, my daughter and twin sons, fight 3 against 1. I did well. They eventually pinned me, of course, but yeah, I did well.
Okay, well, you just have to channel your inner Kyle Snyder.
That's right. I considering, since it's so close to Christmas, Festivus is so close to Christmas, that we don't want to wind up with anyone being injured, including myself. I'll have to keep that in mind, though, for next year for Festivus.
Yeah, don't put yourself in jeopardy. Don't do that. Don't put yourself in harm's way. All right. Well, Chip, I think we've bored our listener long enough. But we can get into what's going on. We got a lot to talk about. The preview of the Rose Bowl, of course, we'll do that a little later in our show. Why don't we start off, Chip, with a very, I say the preview of the Rose Bowl later, but then I'm going to start with something that affects the Rose Bowl. Big injury in camp prior to the Rose Bowl going on with Thayer Munford not participating the last couple days. What is our understanding of Thayer Munford's injury, and what would it mean for the Buckeyes to have to go with Josh Alabi instead of Thayer Munford?
Well, I'm going to answer the second part of that question first, because, to be fair, I think Josh Alabi is serviceable at left tackle. I know that Urban Meyer was effusive in his praise of Josh Alabi going back to last spring when the left tackle position was up for grabs. He would mention Josh Alabi as being one of the guys who he acts like, that position is his. He's a converted defensive lineman. He's played well enough when called upon to do so. So I have confidence that Josh Alabi, if necessary, can do well. I mean, we're going to talk about Washington in much greater detail later in the podcast. I guess my concerns that I would have if I was as an Ohio State fan is that this Washington defense is very, very good. I realize that kind of sound like a broken record, because Ohio State has played against a number of good defenses, and they just put 62 points on what was the statistical best defense in the country. But getting back to the question at hand, it remains to be seen if the injury is that severe that Thayer Munford will not be able to go. I would be concerned not even so much about the injury as much as, okay, what kind of, rust and or, just the fact that Thayer Munford has been inactive in practice, if he's going to be ready to go and go up against what promises to be a very solid Washington defensive front.
Yeah, they're top 20 in the country in every category, and we'll talk more about that later, as you mentioned. But I don't think it's hyperbole to say they might have the best all-around defense Ohio State will have faced all season. Michigan had the number one statistical defense, but of course, they seem to be much better in one area over another, and that area was absolutely decimated by Dwayne Haskins. Um, and quite frankly, Michigan's whole thing this year was to sort of get a lead and force the other team to be one-dimensional. But Washington doesn't need to do that because they're good on all aspects of the defensive front. So not just the front, the back as well. So Thayer Munford being a question mark, I think is a concern just because of that. The offensive line is the one area of a team that has to really work together, almost more so than any other. I think the other part of a football team that has to work well together chemistry-wise is the back seven on defense. But certainly to keep Dwayne Haskins upright is the number one job of this offense, and to be able to give your best player a chance to make plays, and so it's a little concerning. But if you think Josh can do the job, then I'm going to feel a little bit better. I'm going to sleep a little bit better tonight.
Well, like I said, I am merely going off of the fact that he is one of those guys that is consistently mentioned in the rotation as getting reps, getting an opportunity to play. He's a converted defensive lineman, and obviously found his niche after being moved to the offensive side of the ball. But we'll have to wait and see on New Year's Day if Thayer Munford can answer the bell, and if not, if Josh Alabi's ready to go.
Yeah, so it could be two backups on the line with Wyatt Davis already in for Demetrius Knox. But now I feel a little bit better about Wyatt. He's had some more reps, some more practices working with the first team, and I think we'll be okay on that side of the ball. What do you think?
No, I definitely think Wyatt Davis is the fact that he the way he earned the starting position was unfortunate. I mean, nobody wants to be elevated into a starter position due to an injury to somebody else. When Demetrius Knox went down at the tail end, but he performed. Getting back to Wyatt Davis, he performed well against Northwestern, and we had talked about this prior to Demetrius Knox's injury, is that Ohio State knew going into 2019, and since we're on the verge of that they were going to be without some players along the offensive line, such as Demetrius Knox, such as Isaiah Prince, because of the fact that they were losing players due to eligibility. I mean, Michael Jordan, we're not entirely sure what his future is going to be. I'm certainly hoping he's going to be back in 2019. But as far as Wyatt Davis, he certainly was highly recruited, and I thought he played very well against Northwestern. So I feel pretty confident that Wyatt Davis is going to be ready to go against Washington.
Great. All right. Chip, one of the things that happened since we last talked was the signing day, and we got to see what the class looks like now. And I think obviously the big win for Ohio State, Zach Harrison. What is your take overall on signing day?
Very, very happy, considering the fact that only a couple weeks prior to the early signing period, I guess I'm not sure how frequently you ever listen to, or if you've ever listened to Bill King, who is he is completely devoted to talking about college sports and college football being among them. He referred to the early signing period as commitmas, considering it was a week before Christmas. But when you factor in the fact how the entire season, the Urban Meyer, the concerns about everything that transpired, fairly or unfairly, about the Zach Smith situation, the national media narrative, all of that kind of clouded the early season, and then the suspension, and then Urban Meyer with his health issues, and then he stepped down right at the beginning of December. By and large, Ohio State was able to maintain, with the exception, I'm just looking at the list of players that have signed. out of the group of 15 who have officially signed, there were only 2 players who on signing day on the early signing period who flipped to other programs. And as I said, that was actually on that early signing period.
Mm-hmm.
Like the idea of, we talked about this when Ryan Day was elevated to that position, is that the idea of continuity, maintaining the infrastructure, if you will, that Ohio State has developed under Urban Meyer with the strength program, with the Real Life Wednesdays, all those superlatives that are associated with Ohio State football, that they were able to convince and keep the vast majority of the recruits who had verbally committed to play for Ohio State. But let's face it, so many of these young men, in their back of their mind, they're thinking, I want to go play for a certain coach. And Urban Meyer had that rock star mentality and personality that people from all around the country wanted to come and play for him. The results on the field, the results of players being able to get to the NFL and be successful, that's a big was a big draw. And I'm not taking anything away from Urban Meyer. So Ryan Day kind of being able to hold on to these guys, saying, we're going to do everything the same. We're going to have you prepared on the field. We're going to get you to the NFL. Being able to maintain that faith, that continuity that was so important to Gene Smith, I think I would give him a solid effort. The numbers were going to be down anyway, because as Ryan Day alluded to on at his press conference announcing the recruits, that with so many players, they're not entirely sure who's going to be declaring for the NFL draft. Trying to get an idea as to what the scholarship numbers are. The class was going to be relatively small anyway.
Mm-hmm.
You referenced Zach Harrison.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to minimize Zach Harrison as a player. He was highly ranked. The fact that he was the target of not just Ohio State, but Michigan, of Penn State, of just about almost any program in the country. I still believe that Zach Harrison, I think his on the field contributions, that's to be determined. I think when years go by, when I remember this recruiting class, I'm going to look at Zach Harrison, his commitment, as being more of a symbolic affirmation of the faith in Ryan Day that Ohio State is going to be the kind of program that can get me to where I want to go. To me, I think that it's more symbolic than anything that Zach Harrison may contribute on the field.
Right. What it says to me is Ohio State is still the Cadillac program in this part of the country, and the changing of coaches is not going to change that.
Certainly, and I mean, I always maybe I'm I know you're the grumpy old Buckeye, so I don't want to steal your thunder, but I always look at it this way: when people say, "Oh, this so and so was a 5-star and this guy was a 4-star," and I am not suggesting that is unimportant, because there's a reason why. Yes, you want the more highly talented players versus those that may not be. I completely understand that. I always look at it like, when it comes down to it, until they get on campus and on the field and competing against the guys that are already in the program, you really don't know. I know you've seen their film and you've seen them in camp and all that, but you really don't know what you have until they're there. So I always my stock answer is, if Ohio State, if the coaching staff has made the determination that this guy is good enough to play for Ohio State and they want him to play for Ohio State, I am not really going to invest a lot of time and energy into where they rank on, like the 247 Sports or Rivals or any of the. I really don't get really caught up in that, as much as these are the players that Ohio State has truly, that they truly desired, that they wanted, and that they believe that they can be successful on the field. Because when it comes down to it, is the coaches, they're the ones, their livelihoods depend on being able to win with the players that they have on the field, and how well they develop them. So like I have I mean, we mentioned Zach Harrison. I will tell you that another guy that, kind of that affirmation of faith, the very first verbal commitment in the, I guess you would say, the post Urban Meyer era, prior to signing day, was a linebacker out of Cleveland St. Ignatius named Tommy Eichenberg, who was originally a Boston College verbal commitment, and then Ohio State offered him. And Eichenberg is one of these guys that I think is just kind of a stereotypical Ohio kid that grew up always wanted to play for Ohio State until the offer came in. He kind of was taking his time. But Eichenberg is definitely going to be a player I'll be keeping an eye on. I certainly am going to be keeping an eye on another Ohio linebacker named Cade Stover, who I think was Mr. Football for this year. Just a kind of a down-to-earth farming kid who just loves the game. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention a lineman out of Georgia named Harry Miller, who I realize that the article originally was behind the paywall of The Athletic, but it's now free for anyone who hasn't read it. And it was written back in October. Ari Wasserman, a longtime Ohio State beat writer, he covers Ohio State for The Athletic, has a tremendous article about Harry Miller and the relationship that he and his family have with Urban Meyer. And he's going to be one of those guys, he just seems like a solid young man on and off the field. He does a lot of missionary work down in Nicaragua. Just a tremendous, kind of ambassador for the program. So a lot of players that I would be lying if I said, well, I know who's going to be enrolling early. I believe Zach Harrison is one of those. But I really don't know who's all going to be available for spring practice. But certainly a very good beginning to the Ryan Day era at Ohio State.
Yeah, let's stay with Harrison for a minute. He's supposed to arrive on campus, the first week back after the bowl season. How big is this, not just for Ohio State? How big is it that Jim Harbaugh was not able to lure him in this situation at this juncture when you've got Ohio State sort of a changing of the guard? How big of a miss is this for Jim Harbaugh? What does it say about his recruiting and where that program is?
I think it's substantial. I don't want to add more burden to Zach Harrison than there are already. The expectations are going to be sky high. Let's face it. The idea of the number one player in the state of Ohio. I just referenced the idea of, in terms of the recruiting rankings, from what I understand, he's the highest rated Ohio player since Ted Ginn Jr. So that, should kind of give you an idea. But your question about Jim Harbaugh investing a substantial amount of time and energy and commitment to try and sway Zach Harrison in what should have been the kind of approach of, hey, Urban Meyer's no longer there. We're a program on the rise. Rumor has it, and I want to emphasize, rumor has it that Zach Harrison, that he went to the Ohio State-Michigan game, and that was kind of when the rumors were, all right, well, Zach Harrison is leaning towards Michigan. And supposedly after that game, kind of the winds of momentum shifted dramatically in Ohio State's favor, because Zach Harrison has eyes and ears that function very, very well, and he could see, okay, look, this is where the two programs are. So it was kind of, certainly any win over that team up north is certainly welcomed and enjoyed, but that might have been what proved decisive to Zach Harrison, that I really should stay close to home, play under the tutelage of, if not the best, one of the best defensive line coaches in the country, and Larry Johnson. And, as I keep saying it, I think it's just kind of the affirmation of Ryan Day is going to be fine as the head coach at Ohio State.
Absolutely. It was You know, it was big because we're not talking about Michigan losing a recruiting war or battle against Ohio State, with Ohio State coming off of a national championship with Urban Meyer at the height of his powers, with nobody saying anything negative about Urban Meyer. We're talking about the the preseason stuff. We're talking about negative recruiting by national media members actively negatively recruiting Ohio State on behalf of the entire country all season long before there was any talk of this being Meyer's last season, and then the actual transition itself. So all season long, this has been a year-long thing where if you were going to get Ohio State in a recruiting battle, this was going to be the year. And that did not happen with Zach Harrison, which was a very important recruit.
And I was watching I have to confess, I was home. I had the day off, for the holidays, so I took a short break from doing any last minute Christmas shopping to enjoy the early signing period festivities on the Big Ten Network, and Zach Harrison kept everything very, very close to the vest.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody really knew, he didn't even, his Twitter profile was locked up until the moment he decided to announce. And as soon as at Olentangy Orange, where he went to high school, it was going to be kind of an understated affair. In my estimation, as soon as he said that he was going to be playing for Ohio State, I mean, just the palpable jolt of electricity that it felt like. Yes, Ohio State, they don't have nearly the numbers in terms of the actual. I mean, as I said, they only officially signed 15 guys.
Mm-hmm.
Michigan, Penn State have higher ranked recruiting classes, but it just felt from my from my living room that all of a sudden, just even the demeanor of the Big Ten Network analysts when they were describing how Zach Harrison had committed to Ohio State, it just seemed as though the momentum swing in terms of just the attitude, the approach that, as you said, like the recruiting analysts just seemed to kind of take a much more positive outlook on Ohio State going into the future. And let's face it, Ryan Day, I think he was not embellishing when he talked about the quality of athletes that they're bringing in. It's a smaller class, but in terms of the overall ranking, they would rank very high. They would rank third in the country, I believe, behind, like Alabama and Texas A&M or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So this recruiting class, they're going to take a hit just due to the overall numbers, but the quality of these players that they've signed isn't going to take a backseat to anybody.
Yeah, let's get into that a little bit. Only two offensive linemen, but very highly touted offensive linemen. You mentioned Harry Miller, a 5-star center, and Ryan Jacoby, a 4-star out of Mentor. So a pretty good pair, but obviously they need to add some numbers there. The linebackers, what I like about the linebackers, this is going to sound dumb because it is dumb, but what I like about them is they have Ohio State names. Cade Stover, Tommy Eichenberg. Those are Ohio State linebackers. Are those not Ohio State linebacker names?
They are. And not that I don't want this to be anything, sounding against the previous linebackers that Ohio State has signed in previous years. But I just think there's something to be said about these kids that kind of, like I said, Cade Stover growing up on a farm, Tommy Eichenberg playing for Cleveland St. Ignatius, which is one of the powerhouse programs in the Cleveland area and throughout the state of Ohio. These kids that kind of grow up with Ohio State football running through their veins, so to speak, like that kind of that toughness, that name. Like our mutual favorite player of all time, Chris Spielman, like that kind, like those kind of kids. I think there's something to be said about the guys that come in and really have Ohio State football, just that love of the love of the game and the love of the school. First and foremost, I look forward to watching both of them play at that linebacker position.
Absolutely, because here's the thing. You and I, Chip, we want, with every fiber of our being, we want Ohio State to win games.
Certainly.
But we cannot affect the outcome.
No, unfortunately.
Whereas if you get these kids who have this same passion and this same every fiber of their being wanting Ohio State to win, but they have the opportunity to do something about that, that to me is worth a star at least.
Oh, absolutely.
In the recruiting
absolutely.
rankings. I don't put much stock in recruiting rankings for a couple of reasons. Number one, you have to recruit for your system. So a 3-star quarterback might be a much better fit for your offense than a 5-star quarterback. A 5-star quarterback who maybe is a pure pocket passer is not going to do well in a system where you need to run the zone read and the RPOs and all that stuff. And the other thing is that every year we see all around the country guys that are walk-ons or 2-stars or 3-stars or whatever, just excelling and just taking the country by storm. So, the rankings mean very little because a lot of times they're given out when guys are still developing, their bodies are still changing and growing, and you never know what they're going to be like when they put weight on and all of that stuff. So I wouldn't say it's a guessing game, but a lot of it is.
Certainly is. I mean, I know from some of your other tweets that, in terms of the Sunday afternoon watching the NFL, some of the Sunday afternoon tweets that I see from you about your favorite pro team, and, the frustrations that you have about them. And I can relate because, growing up in the Cleveland area, I've been a Browns fan, through and through. And let's face it, I mean, the NFL draft is year after year, there are always players that you're kind of thinking, why did they pick this guy? And then the next thing you know, that guy blossoms into a star, and vice versa. Like the guy that was supposedly a can't miss future Hall of Famer turns out to be a bust.
Yeah.
So at the NFL level, that is investing millions of dollars and countless hours into this process. How do you expect at the high school level, where players, their bodies are still developing? So much of it really, as you said, depends on the system. I think it really depends upon the strength and conditioning program that they're going into. I mean, there's so many X factors, not the least of which is the player's overall psyche and desire. And that's kind of getting back to the idea of, Cade Stover, Tommy Eichenberg, that kind of intensity that they can bring to the program. I mean, we'll see, as I said a few moments ago, when they arrive on campus and when we start to hear from, about practice reports and, this guy, like they're really turning heads and this guy really making big plays, we'll see. And that's part of the reason why I always look forward to the spring game too, is the opportunity to see the freshmen who enroll early. So Zach Harrison will be one of those guys, but also, any of the redshirt freshmen who were kind of covered up in the previous season and didn't really get an opportunity to shine. So like I said, I follow recruiting, but I sometimes think a lot of fans they kind of lose sight of the fact that, like, as you said, like the recruiting rankings, like the star rankings, if you will, that can be a little bit over the top. Whereas to me, give me the guy that wants to be a Buckeye, that the coaches are excited about. And yeah, to kind of, if we can, pour some salt in the wounds or twist that knife into our rivals as we're stealing and breaking their hearts, like a Jim Harbaugh thinking, oh, I'm going to get the number one player in the state of Ohio. So be it. I mean, that's just kind of the cherry on the top of the sundae for me.
Right. Yeah. That's why I always hate missing out on legacy recruits. Like I think in Antoine Winfield Jr., he's a good player where he is, but I think if he goes to Ohio State, he's an even better player. I just believe that in my soul, but there's nothing I can measurably point to prove that, but it's just I guess history has shown me that this has been the case in the past. I got 3 Borins and a couple of Bosas to look at and say, these guys usually do okay if their siblings or their parents or whatever went there.
No, I think you're onto something. I guess we can't really call him a legacy because he's coming up from Texas. But the fact, arguably the best wide receiver in the country out of the high school ranks, signed with Ohio State, Garrett Wilson, and he was very highly recruited. As soon as we talked about the idea of when Urban Meyer stepped down, all the I mean, it was like blood in the water. The sharks, if you will, like all swarming to try and get Garrett Wilson to reconsider his commitment to Ohio State. But Garrett Wilson, even though he's coming up from Texas, he actually lived in Dublin, Ohio for the majority of his formative years, and that made an impression. So, I mean, when you say, kind of like that, you refer to them as like those legacy players. Like, to me, not that I want the best players that the coaching staff believes will ensure Ohio State's success on and off the field. If they're all from Ohio, that's great. If they're from around the country, so be it. But I will freely admit I am very, very partial to those guys who kind of, have that Ohio bloodline, simply because I just think that it means more to them. And I think when it comes down to, at crucial situations, I kind of like playing with that heart and intensity that Ohio State fans have come to know and love from the Buckeyes that have played like that. That I just think that those guys traditionally show that more often than not.
Yeah, I mean, we could look at I think you could look to the Jim Tressel years and see how his teams, maybe weren't always the biggest recruits in terms of, stature and rankings, but he was always able to get so much out of them because they had so much passion for the state of Ohio and for Ohio State.
Certainly. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the critiques of John Cooper was he was not beloved by the Ohio high school coaches, and Jim Tressel was beloved and respected. And I think Urban Meyer is respected, but I think it would also be fair to say that there's probably been some hurt feelings over the years of Urban Meyer's tenure, with some players not getting a look, or if they get a look, it's late and the player has already decided, because there were a number of players Ohio State went after in this recruiting cycle who decided to stick with their commitments elsewhere. Among them, there was an offensive lineman from the Strongsville, Ohio area who decided to stick with his commitment to Michigan State. Even though he had an Ohio State offer, it came late in the process. And that young man felt, Michigan State's been with me this entire time.
Yeah, I mean, it really, everybody's different, and it comes down to what's important. For some guys, it's who believed in me from the beginning. For other guys, this is just the reality of what's, they're recruiting at such a high level, and I'm not really on their radar, but then they come in and say, hey, we do have room for you, and they go, oh yeah, okay, that's still my first choice. So it just depends on the kid. Every kid is different, and honestly, I could say I can't say which way I would go if I was in that situation. Would I go with the people that believed in me from the beginning? Would I go from the people that said, we really like you, but unfortunately we don't have any room, but if something changes, we'll let you know. I can't honestly say where I would end up in that situation, but so I have a lot of respect for these kids and for the process they go through, because it's a difficult process to go through at any time in your life. But can you imagine doing that as a teenager?
No, I can't. And you referenced Jim Harbaugh, having his heart broken by Zach Harrison. And Gerd retweeted an article about a young man in Michigan who had verbally committed to the Wolverines, and I think it was maybe 10 days before the early signing period, and the player's name escapes me. And I believe, I can't recall what position or anything like that, but about 10 days prior to the early signing period, the Wolverines dropped this young man. And like you said, like the stress of this whole process, to be led to believe that you have a scholarship, and then, oh, by the way, like we found somebody that we prefer more. We're going to let you go. I can't even. I mean, like the negative fallout of that amongst the high school coaching ranks, I can't even imagine what that will be. I believe there was a happy ending to that story, though. I believe the young man did eventually sign with another program. Might not even been a Big Ten program, but I think he did get another scholarship offer. But like you said, it's a difficult process for everybody involved. The coaches that are out there on the road, away from their families. I mean, like living out of suitcases. Trying to convince these young men to come, trying to get them to honor their commitments. The players being hounded by all these coaches. I mean, it seems very glamorous to us, the fans, but I'm sure it's a very exhaustive, stressful situation.
Yeah, I mean, I barely navigated my teenage years as it was. No.
I'm glad you and I have something else in common then.
So, yeah, I would much rather have my program not promise a kid and say we like you. If room opens up, we definitely would like to have you, than to promise them a spot and then take it away. That to me is the biggest. I guess it's the lowest thing you can do to these kids is to dangle that carrot and then pull it away because you found somebody else. I think if you want your kids to honor their commitments, then you as a program, you have to honor your commitments.
I agree. That's that's part of the reason why I think I don't know. I'm of the opinion that if you wanted to clean this up, if you wanted to, and I realize it would take all of the drama and all of the suspense out of it. If you wanted to make it where if you extend a scholarship offer to a kid and that they could immediately accept it and it was like they could sign on the dotted line whenever, like it didn't have to necessarily be in the middle of December or in the case of like the official national signing day in February.
Mm-hmm.
You'd be amazed at how much more cautious both sides would be. As it turns out, like some players, I mean, they, as soon as they take a recruiting visit, they verbally commit, and then they take a recruiting trip the next week and they verbally commit there. It's like, if you made it where, no, you have to, when you sign on the dotted line, that's it. I think it would, if you made it like that, I think it would dramatically kind of slow down a lot of the drama on both sides.
That is a good segue, Chip, into our quarterback discussion, because isn't Dwayne Mathis on like his third or fourth school now?
Something like that. It's a very circuitous. I'm trying to mumble that word out. Route that he has taken, because I want to say originally he was verbally committed to Iowa State, and then switched to Michigan State, and then it was in the summer that he came for a visit, and there was another young quarterback from the Florida area. I'm going to probably mispronounce this young man's name, Brian Maurer, who was at the camp to try and earn the scholarship offer. Since Dwayne Mathis had been kind of more the apple of Ohio State's coaching staff's eye collectively, Ohio State did not offer Brian Maurer a scholarship. They gave it to Dwayne Mathis. Dwayne Mathis was in the recruiting class up until the morning of December 19th, when lo and behold, he signed with Georgia, where he has never even visited.
Yeah, that seems crazy to me, to commit to a program that you have not even been to see them. But, that's his latest choice, and, more power to him. The bigger question for Ohio State is, how important now is it for Ohio State to close the alleged loop on Justin Fields, who, could become available very, very soon after Georgia's bowl game?
I think it's extremely important. You say it's old habit. It's going to be very, 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 very difficult to break.
Ryan Day.
Ryan Day. Yeah, because technically Urban Meyer is still the head coach, but Ryan Day, as of January 2nd, is the head coach, and maybe it'll be much easier when Ryan Day is the one who is, pretty much on the field, in the gaze of the cameras. But getting back to the quarterback conundrum, Ryan Day emphasized how much he wants to have at least 4 in the program. And presently, what they have is, all right, they have Dwayne Haskins, who has not yet made his intentions known for 2019, but we all believe that those intentions include the NFL. They have Tate Martell. They have Matthew Baldwin. Now, Dwan Mathis would have been number 4. So that being the case, Justin Fields does come now, and Dwayne Haskins leaves. Now you're at 3. Now that leaves Ohio State had a graduate transfer from West Virginia, Chris Chuganoff, and he'll be on the roster again.
Chugs,
yeah. But
how can you not love a guy named Chugs?
Exactly. He actually got he was able to get a snap or 2 against Rutgers, if you recall, because that's when Tate Martell kind of took some tough shots. But yeah, getting back to it. Justin Fields, highly touted, highly coveted quarterback. That, let's face it, he sees the quarterback development of Dwayne Haskins, and rumor has it would love to have the opportunity to play for Ryan Day, because he believes that would be the best avenue for his future career, hopefully into the NFL.
In other words, he saw Ohio State play this year.
He certainly did, and I like the video clip of him coming off the field. I believe it was against South Carolina, and him kind of saying, "Yeah, I handed the ball off." Like he was not happy with the way he was used. It just seemed as though Georgia did not really try to. And Georgia, in their defense, they had Jake Fromm, who was a very efficient quarterback and is a very efficient quarterback for them. They really, it didn't seem as though that they really had a good plan in place as to how they would use Justin Fields. So it's not a done deal. Everything that I have read online is Ohio State is the front runner. Oklahoma is certainly up for consideration, and let's give credit to Lincoln Riley, because the last 2 years having Heisman Trophy quarterbacks, that would kind of catch any young man's attention.
Right.
So Justin Fields certainly would be understandable for him to be looking in Oklahoma's direction. The only issue for Oklahoma is, from what I understand, getting back to the kind of the recruiting side of things, I believe they signed a very talented quarterback from high school. So he might be looking at a situation where, all right, I just left a situation in Georgia, whereas Ohio State, I think he sees a much clearer and direct pathway to that starting quarterback position.
Right. For those who are not familiar with Justin Fields, first of all, watch more college football. Second of all, here's a guy who has split some snaps with Jake Fromm. It's not exactly the Tate Martell situation. The Bulldogs liked to get Justin Fields into the game, even when the game was early on. Sometimes they'd give him a series. But here's a guy who had slightly better completion percentage than Fromm. Didn't throw an interception, 4 touchdowns, no interceptions. He's got some talent. He can run. Very athletic kid. I think he'd be perfect for Ryan Day's situation.
And wasn't he I may be mistaken, wasn't he the number 1 overall recruit for 2018? Or if not the number 1 overall, like maybe the number 1 dual threat? I know that I just went on this little mini rant, not really, but I'm just going off of what I have read and heard from people as soon as this was announced that Justin Fields was in the transfer portal and was strongly considering Ohio State. And I have to be completely transparent about this. As soon as I heard that there was interest in Ohio State, I was pleased, but I was kind of surprised, because I remember Justin Fields originally was verbally committed to Penn State, and then he signed with Georgia. But as you said, I think the Ryan Day effect certainly is playing strongly into Justin Fields' mindset for why he's considering the Buckeyes.
Yeah, so it's important for Ohio State to close that deal if they can, and if they can, I don't think that Tate Martell is necessarily the starting quarterback next year.
No, he isn't, but it kind of raises an interesting dilemma for Tate Martell because Justin Fields would be trying to become immediately eligible the same way that like Shea Patterson did for Michigan. I believe that Justin Fields has the same attorney who argued on behalf of the NCAA, to try and get that immediate eligibility. Now, if I'm Tate Martell, no matter what, if he transfers the day after the Rose Bowl or if he transfers next fall, he's going to be sitting out for a year, no matter what. Whereas it still remains to be seen if, as I said, Justin Fields, I think he's gonna try to get that eligibility. It would seem to me it would make a heck of a lot more sense. And I don't know Tate Martell's academic situation, but to try and almost go like the Joe Burrow route, if he could, of trying to not only win the job in the spring, but academically, if possible, and it would, I'm pleading complete ignorance here. I have no idea in terms of what Tate Martell's major is or how far along he is in terms of his degree. But if he can get that degree and graduate in the summer, then he would be immediately eligible if he transferred. Mm-hmm. See what I'm saying? Like it might be in Tate Martell's best interest to actually battle Justin Fields if he's there in the spring. And at the end of the spring, if it appears that Justin Fields is going to be the starter, then Tate Martell can kind of reevaluate and assess, some possible destinations. But if I'm Tate Martell, I'm gonna battle. I'm not gonna just kind of resign myself to the fact that okay, they're interested in this other shiny new toy. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna battle for that job that you believe is rightfully yours.
Yeah, I don't think Tate Martell doesn't seem like the kind of kid who backs down from challenges. He seems like a pretty tough-minded kid. So, but yeah, the thing about the transfers, when you and I grew up watching football, it was rare. Now it seems like they've really relaxed the rules, and it's becoming more and more apparent that we have to do what's right for the kids, and if they are not getting what they can get at the program they're at, it makes sense to allow them to go somewhere else and play and make the most of these years because you don't get them back. So, like in years past, I don't think a Shea Patterson walks in and starts the next year at Michigan. I think he takes a year off. I think there were a lot more stringent rules in place, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Certainly. And in the case of Justin Fields, there was a racial incident that kind of, if you will, was kind of a factor in his decision to make himself available on the transfer portal. So it might not be in the NCAA's best interest to deny Justin Fields immediate eligibility.
Yeah. Okay, so before we completely turn our attention away from recruiting, I think it's an important victory for Ohio State on the 2020 front was the commitment of G. Scott, wide receiver, very highly touted wide receiver. This is a kid across the country that is a big early win for not only for Ryan Day but also for Brian Hartline, who is now the full-time wide receivers coach.
And I'm just completely stumped on this in this capacity. I don't remember. We've referenced a lot of the previous coaching regimes. I don't remember the last time Ohio State had a recruit from the state of Washington. I'm being completely in terms. I know that we talk about the Ohio kids. We talk about how Ohio State has kind of established a footprint in Texas and all these other areas of the country, but to be that far across the country and for Ryan Day to have made such a positive impression on this young man, I think speaks volumes about Ryan Day's offensive reputation as somebody who's going to put his players in the best possible positions to succeed.
Yeah, when I was blogging over at Our Honor Defend, the blog manager there, Vico, who went on to 11 Warriors as I did as well, he could tell you that. He could tell you this is the first guy from such and such a state since, and then he'd rattle off the next name. I don't know if he tracks it with a spreadsheet. I don't know if he keeps it all locked up in his mind. He's a pretty sharp guy, but he could have told you this, and it's a shame that we don't have access to his brain, like a hard drive, like let me just go on the network and find this information from Vico. But G. Scott, I think a big win early in Ryan Day. I mean, Ryan Day's not even the full-time head coach yet. He's already winning guys' hearts and minds that are, on the other side of the country. I think that just speaks volumes about how seriously he's taking the recruiting aspect of the job.
Yeah, and the commitment came on Christmas. So you want to talk about Christmas coming a little early symbolically in the sense of, as you said, he's a 2020 recruit. The fact that Ryan Day is not yet the official head coach, but he's getting verbal commitments for guys who will comprise the 2020 class. You can't speak enough positive things about Ryan Day and the direction that the Ohio State program is going in.
Yeah. All right. So you mentioned a little bit ago Dwayne Haskins and declaring for the NFL. Some big news came out in the last week in terms of, a couple of items actually came out in the last week. One of them not surprising at all. Dwayne Haskins gets a first-round NFL grade. That pretty much seals the deal in my mind that, he's going to be declaring after the Rose Bowl. The other thing that tells me he's going to be declaring after the Rose Bowl is he just made several $1 million in the fact that Justin Herbert from Oregon is not going pro. He is going to return to Oregon for another year, which means that if Herbert was higher on guys' draft boards than Haskins, now he doesn't have that one player ahead of him. And, he could be the number one overall quarterback chosen.
I have no doubt that he will be. And I certainly believe when you look at the quarterbacks available in the 2019 NFL draft, and as you said, it's Justin Herbert was kind of presumed to have been the front runner, but Dwayne Haskins was. I was seeing online some mock drafts that had Dwayne Haskins certainly in the first round, and when I think of the other players like Will Grier of West Virginia he skipped the bowl game.
Mm-hmm. Look what happened to them.
Exactly. Will Grier had a very good career at West Virginia, but I think it'd be fair to say Dwayne Haskins certainly would be evaluated ahead of him. I watched some of the Duke Temple game. They have a quarterback, Daniel Jones, who has not yet declared as we're recording this, who also is kind of highly regarded. But again, Dwayne Haskins would be higher rated. It's getting to the 2019 NFL draft. The strength of that draft is going to be, especially within the first round, along the defensive line position. All around the country, there are a number of talented defensive linemen who will be available. But we all know, regardless of what team that we may follow intensely or casually, that quarterbacks are always at a premium. So it's not entirely beyond belief that Dwayne Haskins could be, if not the first player picked, probably one of the very first few players picked, just because if you want a top-notch quarterback, Dwayne Haskins might be your best chance at it. So it should be interesting to see if any kind of, number one, if Dwayne Haskins, if he declares, which we believe he will, and number two, what kind of bidding war ensues for some of those high NFL draft choices. As of right now, I believe like the Arizona Cardinals, they have Josh Rosen. I think that the Cardinals would have the first pick in the draft, but who's to say that they wouldn't open up auctioning to the highest bidder, who may be seeking, who they believe might be a franchise quarterback in Dwayne Haskins.
It could be a Nick Bosa, Dwayne Haskins top 2.
It certainly could be. It would not be surprising at all, because John Gruden is sitting right now, I think, at number 2. If the draft were to end, or if the draft were to be held today, the Raiders, I think, have that second pick. And there's been rumors that Gruden might be wanting to move on, from Carr at quarterback. So it would not be surprising if it went, to me, if it went Bosa Haskins.
Well, I don't wish Haskins on or Gruden on Haskins.
No, neither do I. Neither do I. That would be a very, very, very difficult assimilation, considering the wordiness of his play calls.
All right. So I'm not a huge recruiting guy. I do keep a sort of one eye on it. I'm not, but I appreciate your insights on that, Chip. And I don't think either of us would consider ourselves recruiting experts, but I think we both sort of like to see who's coming up the pipeline, and it's kind of important, I think, moving forward. Ohio State has to round out this class a little bit. Need some offensive linemen. Didn't get a cornerback. Lost the Jordan battle. And to Alabama. But I think importantly, if you were going to get Ohio State, this was the year to get them in the recruiting battles, and only 2 flips. I think it's a big, just a great job by this staff to keep intact what they had for the most part, especially considering not only the transition at the top, but nobody knows which position coaches are coming back, which leads me to my next point. Greg Schiano made some remarks this week that kind of indicate he may be elsewhere next year.
Yeah, there's been a lot of strong speculation that Greg Schiano's on his way out the door. I think Greg Schiano was a good, loyal soldier to Ohio State during the whole Urban Meyer, Zach Smith fiasco in the summer. He didn't squawk or make any stink about the fact that Ryan Day was elevated to the interim head coach during Urban Meyer's suspension.
Mm-hmm.
But it also might be the kind of thing where Ryan Day, who's to say that Ryan Day behind the scenes was not really a big fan of the way that Greg Schiano ran the defense this year.
Well, who was?
Might be. Well, yeah, it certainly did not help Greg Schiano's. I guess you could say, he did not bolster his argument with the fact that Auburn torched Purdue yesterday in their bowl game. Putting 70 points on Purdue, and the national Twitterverse was wondering how is it that Purdue beat Ohio State by 29 points, and revisiting the fact that, Ohio State, they kept bringing 8 guys up to the line of scrimmage, and the strategies that Ohio State used against Purdue just were mind-boggling, to say the least. So I wish Greg Schiano nothing but the best, regardless of whether it's at Ohio State or elsewhere, but I would be surprised if he is back in Columbus in some capacity next year.
Yeah, and I think you and I talked about that when Ryan Day was elevated, which assistants were probably moving on. I think we both said Schiano and Bill Davis likely were out. I haven't changed my stance on that at all. I think that maybe, Alex Grinch was a guy who was sort of a DC in waiting, the way sort of Ryan Day was a head coach in waiting, unofficially. So that could be that could be your guy next year. Although it remains to be seen. We don't know. We weren't in the rooms. We don't know sort of how much friction there might have been between Grinch and Schiano. How much of the concepts were Grinch's, how much of it was Schiano's, or whether it was a mixture of the two that just didn't mesh very well, because this was not an acceptable year for Ohio State's defense, and there's plenty of blame to spread around. A new coach in the defensive backfield, taking over for Kerry Combs. There was a lot of things going on, and it's difficult to know exactly where the crux of the problems were coming from. Now, of course, Schiano, being the defensive coordinator, has to take the bulk of the blame for that. getting back to that Purdue thing, it was honestly the biggest problem for Ohio State was stopping Purdue. It wasn't necessarily getting down the field. There were obviously red zone issues, but if Purdue had tackled against Ohio State the way they did against Auburn, that outcome would have been much different. That was not the Purdue team we saw yesterday in the bowl game as we record this. Is not the team that showed up on that evening, all emotional for Tyler Trent and wanting to put on a show for him, and and certainly Ohio State may be feeling a little bit satisfied from sort of in the wake of the Penn State thing.
Yeah, I think that Purdue team that night in West Lafayette, like you said, the fact that it was the home crowd, the Tyler Trent factor, Ohio State schematic deficiencies on the defensively, I think those all contributed. But let's take Purdue out of the equation. I think there have been a lot of defensive, just puzzling things. When you go back to the season opener against Oregon State, when you think about some big plays against TCU. I mean, just so on and on and on. And when you have former Buckeyes like James Laurinaitis and Bobby Carpenter and Chris Spielman wondering, okay, what are they doing schematically? It just kind of makes me think that maybe Greg Schiano, he is such a fervent belief in his scheme that he's neglecting the fact that maybe he doesn't have the personnel to run it. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's something that Ryan Day is evaluating behind the scenes.
Yeah, we'll know very soon, I think, after the bowl game, like within days, what's going to happen. No pun intended there. But one thing I did note from Purdue's loss is all of the talk about the transitive victory Auburn had over Ohio State. But I don't remember Ohio State getting a transitive ×2 victory over Oklahoma when Ohio State beat Maryland. That didn't seem to be in the public eye.
No, or the fact that, of course, like every SEC fan comes out of the woodwork to claim that Auburn victory as their own. Like the proud fans of the Tennessee Volunteers who somehow claim that Auburn victory as one of their own, simply because they're sitting at home for the holidays and not being in a bowl game. So, yeah, like you said, the transitive effect is not in effect, if you will.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to work both ways. Like, oh yeah, you get a transitive victory over Ohio State. Ohio State never gets that transitive victory.
No.
Probably because there are just so few losses that it's hard for them to get credit for them. Anyway, I wonder at what point in that game yesterday Jeff Brom was thinking, why did I turn down Louisville?
Yeah, that might have not only crossed his mind, but I think last year Purdue, the fact that they made a bowl game, I think was kind of a minor miracle. It kind of spoke volumes of Jeff Brom. Mm-hmm. And I think this year's team, just from a distance, probably was kind of, all right, well, we deserve to be in a bowl, and they didn't really have the same kind of focus on the bowl game that they should have. So often a lot of these bowl games, because so many of them are blowouts, a lot of them, it really comes down to, okay, who really wants to be there, and kind of shifting the goal, the spotlight, if you will, from one Big Ten team to another on, watching the Pinstripe Bowl. You could see the Miami Hurricanes wanted to be anywhere else than on that field against Wisconsin. I mean, it was evidenced by just the sheer route that was put on. So I just think, so often bowl games, it's so difficult, considering there's usually such a substantial gap between the end of the regular season to when the bowl games take place, that you can kind of get a feel for, all right, which players really want to be there, or which teams really want to be there, which players have their one eye, out the door, thinking about the NFL. It can be a challenging thing to predict.
It can, and one of the things that I I've noticed about bowl games, and I thought that Wisconsin would get absolutely pasted because of the fact that they've struggled so much on offense, and Miami has a really stout defense against the run. I thought Wisconsin was going to get just blasted, put on full blast. I didn't get to see that game, but when I saw the outcome, I thought, wow. And then I saw Kyle Rowland, I believe, was that said, this was the least interested team I've ever seen, in a bowl game, and it just reminded me instantly of the 1990 Liberty Bowl because I was drinking in Papa Joe's on High Street the night before the team left to go to that bowl game. Kirk Herbstreit was there, Greg Smith, about 5 or 6 of the other players were in the bar that night, and they looked like their dog had died. Like they're out drinking and they just looked miserable. And I actually spoke to Herbstreit for a few minutes and to Greg Smith, and it was pretty clear to me that they didn't want to go. And if there had been a Bovada, or one of these online betting sites at that time, I would have taken everything I had, sold it, and bet against Ohio State winning that game, and they got beat, and they were kind of embarrassed by Air Force.
They weren't kind of, they were. I wasn't with you, but I was with you from afar, in spirit. I can distinctly remember watching that game, and just you could just tell the disdain and disgust of that entire process. I mean, that was probably, if I had to summarize, like the lowest point of John Cooper's tenure, it was one of, because when you go back even beyond that bowl game a few weeks earlier, Ohio State, if they beat Michigan, they're going to the Rose Bowl. Mm-hmm. And instead, okay, well, let's try and run the option with Kent Graham. And then it gets stopped short, and then Michigan kicks a field goal and, denies Ohio State the Rose Bowl. And I can't remember all the different bowl tie-ins, but somehow Ohio State tumbles all the way down to the Liberty Bowl in Memphis, Tennessee against Air Force. And as you said, just the lack of effort, everything, it was one of those things where that probably, the subsequent recruiting class was, because that was, pre-early signing period, in mm-hmm. February was, the 1991 signing class was very low ranked because Ohio State did not do well in 1990. It was one of those things where the direction of the program was definitely, it was not pointing upwards at that point.
Right, and that's kind of what circles me back to my original point, is that in the bowl games you never know what's going to happen because emotion is such a big part of college football, and a team that is happy and excited to be playing is going to generally have their way with a team that doesn't want to be there. And that's what enables, a quote-unquote national championship UCF team to beat an Auburn that if they win the Iron Bowl, they have, they open the door to a wealth of riches. But they don't win the Iron Bowl, so they end up going to play UCF. They're not excited to be there, and they get beat. Utah gets a victory because they're playing an Oklahoma team doesn't want to be playing Utah. Boise State can go and win a BCS bowl game. I mean, not to say that those aren't good quality teams, but when they want to be there and they're excited to be there, and this is a big thing for their school, and the other team is like in a consolation game, it's the emotional level. They cannot reach that emotional level. They cannot match that emotional level, and that puts them right for these quote unquote upsets. And we see it every year.
And I certainly think that's the nice thing for Ohio State fans and Washington fans, for that matter, is that the Rose Bowl is certainly. I'm disappointed that Ohio State's not in the playoff, but if there is such a thing as a consolation prize, sign me up for the Rose Bowl every time. I mean, I've never been. I've already told Mrs. Minnich that's on the bucket list.
Yeah, same.
Of destinations. It's going to happen. The fact that, I could probably, hours before the game, find a nearby In-N-Out burger, and, be completely full, during the game, and, get to watch a game against the backdrop of the sun and the sun setting over the mountains and all that. The Rose Bowl, I certainly think qualifies for both teams. I have not seen anything that leads me to believe that either team is going into this in an emotional vacuum.
Yeah, this is a game where people are going to be excited. That's why we haven't seen, Chip, 15 guys say they're not going to play in this game.
I don't think the Wolverines got the memo that the idea that, all right, to declare that you're not going to be playing in the bowl game usually means that you're considered a high NFL draft pick, not a marginal NFL draft pick. So the idea that Karan Higdon is sitting out was immediately and well-deservedly mocked, because you're talking about a player who, even with participation in the bowl game, was going to be a day 3, which means like 4th to 7th round possible draft choice. Not definite, possible draft choice. The fact that he is going to sit this one out, as well as Michigan's going to be without Rashawn Gary. They're going to be without Devin Bush. One of their offensive linemen, again, who is marginal at best, is sitting out. So I think, you mentioned the whole Bovada thing. I know which way I'd be leaning if I had money, and it certainly would not be on the Wolverines in the Peach Bowl. That's for sure.
Yeah, and that a lopsided loss in that game could be yet another warning sign, warning bell for Jim Harbaugh. And then when supposedly the New York Jets are going to make a run at him, that might make him think a little harder about that offer.
I think I personally I scoff at the idea that he would be that highly coveted by the NFL. Because
your team is not run by a Michigan alum.
I want him to.
This is why I want Jim Harbaugh to be the Jets head coach, because I'm a Dolphins fan and I'm afraid he's going to be our next head coach.
Okay, that's true. I never thought about it from that point of view. I think of what he, and I want to give him credit. What he did initially at San Francisco was well worth the praise. What he did at Stanford, well worth the praise. But as the years have gone by, when you start to look at the fact that, okay, when he was, down the stretch at San Francisco, that team kind of started to falter and flounder, and it had nothing to do with the fact that he played at Ohio State. I think Alex Boone kind of said, after a while, dealing with that guy he was just kind of a nut job. And, like not wanting, and Alex Boone, he's certainly I'm not taking shots at him, but, he's had kind of a checkered past. I think he'd freely admit that. But, I don't think Jim Harbaugh's approach works in the NFL. I give credit to Urban Meyer for recognizing the fact that his style wouldn't work in the NFL either. But I just think Jim Harbaugh, I don't think he approaches recruiting from the same intense level that a lot of the premier programs like Alabama, like Clemson, like Oklahoma, and Ohio State also do. And I think, as you said, it remains to be seen. But I think the Peach Bowl, if the Wolverines lose that one, it's just going to open up another offseason of question marks and finger pointing up in Ann Arbor.
Absolutely. And I think that if Jim Harbaugh's smart and sees the writing on the wall and loses badly to Florida, and knowing that going into the next year, if he loses to Ryan Day, that could be the final straw. That would probably give him a little more incentive to listen to NFL teams, even if they're not offering tons and tons of cash. And I think that would actually enable a Jets team to maybe take a little bit of money off the table. But yes, as a Dolphins fan, owned by Jeffrey Ross, a Michigan man, I am. Or Stephen Ross. Jeffrey Ross is the comedian. But
results are the same.
Yeah, both they're laughable either way. Both the guys are laughable. Yeah, it's scary to me to think that Adam Gase could be replaced by a Jim Harbaugh, because Adam Gase to me is a guy who probably is a good head coach if he just hands off the play calling duties, and if he doesn't have Ryan Tannehill as his quarterback, and if he doesn't have 7,000 injuries to his starting players on the offensive line and all across the defense. He probably is a pretty okay head coach, but I don't want to go through the Jim Harbaugh rebuild only to see Jim Harbaugh fired and then having the Dolphins start all over again. So I'm very hopeful the Jets get their man.
Well, I feel your pain for the first time in I can't recall. The Cleveland Browns actually seem to be kind of going in the right direction. I mean, it granted they're still mediocre, which kind of speaks volumes about how deplorable the Browns have been for over 20 years. But the fact that it seems like they finally have found a franchise quarterback, and they've got some stud players defensively to build around. It looks like the offseason is not going to be dominated by a Browns coaching search, even though like there are going to be people interested in the job. It's not going to be nearly the same kind of coaching search that in years past, or a search for a franchise quarterback.
Well, honestly, Denzel Ward fixed that team.
Certainly did.
And the huge addition by subtraction of Hugh Jackson was probably worth every win that they've gotten this year.
Oh, absolutely.
All right, we can't put it off anymore, Chip. Let's talk about the Rose Bowl. We started to talk about it a little bit. I think that you're right. I think both teams are invested emotionally. Whatever disappointment Ohio State players may have had about missing the college football playoff certainly will be replaced by wanting to send Urban Meyer out with a Rose Bowl victory. He's never been a Rose Bowl winning coach, and he's never coached in a Rose Bowl. This is one of the things that he'd like to have on his mantle. His last game, theoretically, I know there's people that doubt that, but this is an opportunity for the troops to really rally for him, and it's so I think the emotional investment is there. I think the fact that you haven't seen all these guys saying they're not going to play. And the one thing that I really worried about when Justin Herbert said he was coming back to Oregon was for Dwayne Haskins to say, okay, then I'm gonna just kind of sit this one out. I like it. I like the fact that there aren't all these guys that say they're not going to play their last game. Even Draymond Jones, who kind of last time we talked, we didn't think he was going to play, but he said he was in. So, what do you make of this matchup overall?
Maybe I'm in the minority here because we didn't really go into great detail about this as of yet. I think this is going to be a much closer game than I think a lot of Ohio State fans have given Washington credit for. Simply because I'm looking at, when I looked at Washington's schedule, now granted, they lost the season opener, in one of the kickoff games, down in Atlanta. They lost to Auburn, 21-16. They lost at Oregon in overtime, 30-27, and they lost to Cal 12-10. Now, when you think about it, you're talking about, okay, 3 losses that, by and large, were never out of any game by any great stretch. And what is that? 10 points away from being undefeated. Now, I mean, most of their games were, I will say, kind of, relatively close. Like, I think like the biggest margins of victory that they had, I think they beat Colorado by 2 touchdowns.
You're not counting, obviously, North Dakota.
No, I am not counting North Dakota. Nor should any college football playoff committee member. But I digress. In terms of how teams are evaluated, I think probably when I look at that best win that Washington had was in the Apple Cup the night before the Ohio State Michigan game. Watching it when Washington was at Washington State, and they beat Washington State 28-15, and it turned out to be kind of a snowstorm up there. The reason why I thought that was impressive is, Washington State not only was favored, but it was the kind of, okay, Washington State wins this, they're going to win their division in the Pac-12, which obviously Washington was able to steal that from them and then go on and defeat Utah and win the Pac-12. I referenced that, that Oregon loss. To me, that loss was probably their, if there is such a thing as a best loss, simply because that game back in October when they lost in overtime, as I said, not only in overtime, that was the only time that a team was able to score more than 24 points against Washington all season. So defensively, this team, you referenced it at the beginning of the podcast, that's part of the reason why I think this is going to be a tough game. I don't see this being a blowout. Maybe you disagree. I know that I've read and heard a lot of people saying Ohio State's going to wallop these guys. I think Washington defensively is very well coached. And when you go back and look at the scores of the games throughout the season, I think it kind of references the fact that I think Washington is going to be very well prepared for this Ohio State offense.
They're very good at hanging around, as you mentioned. I don't see it as a blowout. I think the only way that Ohio State blows out this Washington team is if they find a schematic advantage offensively and are able to exploit it, and then Washington does never make an adjustment. Kind of like, other teams we could mention that were Ohio State played recently.
Yes.
Michigan with their number one defense. Ohio State found one guy to pick on and picked on him relentlessly, and just made a mockery of their defense. I don't think Washington's coaching staff are that short-sighted. I think that they will have the team well prepared. Obviously, they will be very motivated to beat a team that, a lot of people think probably should have been in the college football playoff. So, emotionally, they're going to be up for the game. Ohio State will be emotionally up for the game. Can they match each other's emotional level is something that will remain to be seen. Ohio State, if things don't go well early for one team or the other, what happens at that point? That's a big question mark. But as you mentioned, this team lost 3 games by a combined 10 points. They held Cal's offense to just 12 points, even though they lost that game. In 2 games against Utah scored 10 points against them. And one of those games was at Utah. So, again, but, Utah did have a lot of injuries the second time they played and stuff, but still very impressive. I wasn't quite as impressed with the Apple Cup win because for a couple reasons. Number one, the weather played much more into Washington's hands than it did Washington State's based on the way they play. And number two, the Cougars in the Apple Cup lately have just been awful. I mean, they just can't buy a win in that series. So, but this is a team that does a lot of things well. Washington's defense, as I mentioned earlier, in the top 20 in every category. They are 5th in scoring defense. This is really where they excel, is making you kick field goals. 5th in the country. They allow 15.5 points a game. That's pretty impressive. Their rush defense is 15th. They only allow 116 yards a game. Ohio State, not a prolific rushing team, although the Buckeyes have been better of late. Pass defense is 19th. That's a place where maybe Dwayne Haskins can get after them, but again, they're going to have to keep him upright, and with Thayer Munford potentially not playing or not playing 100%, that could be an issue on that blind side. Total defense, Washington is 12th. They allow 301.8 yards per game, or roughly half of what Ohio State gets a game. Washington's issues are on offense, where they are very pedestrian. They are 85th in scoring offense, 26.6 points a game. Rushing offense is 55th, 179.9 yards a game, although they do have a very good running back in Gaskins. And the passing offense, 66th in the country, 232.5 yards per game. Total offense, 58th at 412.4 yards per game. Now, Chip, they've got a veteran quarterback, Jake Browning, who has a a very respectable 65% pass completion percentage, but he does some really brain dead things sometimes. He's got 16 touchdowns, 10 interceptions this year, and I've seen Washington enough on the the Pac-12 After Dark to see Jake Browning make some plays where you just go, what were you even looking at right there?
Yeah, I certainly agree with you about the pedestrian Washington offense. And I guess as somebody who has admired Chris Peterson for a number of years, it would have been fair to say that when Chris Peterson took over at Washington several years ago, the idea that kind of the offensive fireworks that he was associated with at Boise State, I thought, oh, wow, I can't imagine what it's going to be like when he gets to Washington. And that has not materialized in his tenure with the Huskies. The one thing that has been consistent is that stellar defense. So he's certainly making the most of what he has. Getting back to Jake Browning, I agree with you. He is usually good for some kind of puzzling decision, maybe a couple. So I think it's going to be imperative that Ohio State gets some pressure on Browning. As you said, that 65% completion percentage is something that Ohio State fans have to be prepared for. Is that Browning? He's not going to wow you, but he'll most of the time make the right decision. Sometimes he'll make the wrong decision and at the worst possible time. Like you said, Myles Gaskin, very impressive. Almost, like a little over 1,100 yards on the ground, 10 touchdowns, almost 5 yards a carry. Not much of a receiver. Looking at his stats, 18 receptions, only 1 touchdown. As a receiver, he is more of that kind of, that you could say that bell cow running back. Offensively, if there's a player that I'm going to be very concerned about, and this kind of goes back to that Ohio State defensive scheme, I'm going to throw a name out at you. Tight end Drew Sample, listed 6'5", 251 pounds, 23 receptions, a couple touchdowns, but he averages, almost, 11 yards a reception. So he's not their leading receiver. Their leading receiver is Aaron Fuller, who has 51 receptions, averaging almost 16 yards a catch. But I'm just concerned about when we talk about Washington looking at Ohio State defensively, and you and I have expressed our frustration with Ohio State putting their linebackers in bad situations defensively. Who's going to draw the short straw, so to speak, and have to cover Drew Sample? Like that would be, I could totally picture Jake Browning not being able to get to Aaron Fuller or another one of his wide receivers, Andre. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Baselia. That's how it looks to me. But you're the one who's the Pac-12 After Dark guy. If either of those receivers aren't available, checking down and hitting Drew Sample, I could see that being a cause of concern for Ohio State defensively.
Yeah, and whether it's Bakelia or Baselia, I can't remember, but my recollection of him is he's a guy that kind of moves the chains, but I'm more worried about Ty Jones, who is a sophomore wide receiver who doesn't have as many catches, but he has he has a bigger yards per catch average than Bakelia, and 6 touchdowns. He leads the team in receiving touchdowns, so he's a guy that can make plays. So Fuller and Jones will be the guys that I would be mostly worried about. Sample I would be worried about just because Ohio State traditionally has a problem with tight ends, and when you're talking about a guy trying to cover a big guy with a guy the size of maybe a Pete Werner, it doesn't usually work out well.
I certainly agree with you. And I, in terms of, I've expressed my admiration all season for Ohio State offensively, with KJ Hill being one of those guys who's just consistent at making clutch plays. So if Washington has, with Bakelia or Baselia, however it's pronounced, between him with Jones, with Aaron Fuller, if they have those kind of players that can keep the Ohio State offense off the field, that is going to be like I said, I think this is going to be a much closer game than I think Ohio State fans realize. And we haven't even talked about the Washington defensive personnel yet.
Yeah, and I fully anticipate that at some point Myles Gaskin's going to break a long run for a touchdown the way that Ohio State has given up this year. Some big plays. I think that he's the kind of guy that will do that, and this team gave up a big running touchdown to Northwestern. Now, whether that was aided by a face mask and holding or not, it was still a long touchdown run. I think Washington certainly is capable of that. And the other thing you've got to worry about with Chris Peterson is at the very right time, he will call the trick play that has your defense completely lost.
Well, we all, you referenced the Boise State Oklahoma Fiesta Bowl win, from several years ago. I think any Ohio State fan who cannot recall it, do yourself a favor and just spend a few moments on YouTube, to refresh your memory. The hook and ladder play, the Statue of Liberty play, all those things that were so vital in that upset. That's the kind of stuff that Chris Peterson, like I said a few moments ago, that's kind of how he built his reputation as an offensive mastermind. It hasn't really materialized in Washington. I certainly don't want it to materialize as 2019 begins on New Year's Day in the Rose Bowl against Ohio State.
Yeah, when he feels his team's the underdog, he will empty the playbook, and that's not something that we've seen from Ohio State. We know that Ohio State has trick plays in the book. They just never used them.
Yeah.
But when Chris Peterson feels he needs an advantage, he's not only adept at, or not only willing to call any play that he's got, but he's also adept at picking the perfect time to run it. So that's something that Ohio State's defense just has to be sound. And that's not something that we've seen a lot of this year from them. So one thing they're gonna have to watch for is blitzing. As we start to talk a little bit more about Washington's defense, Taylor Rapp's a defensive back, but he leads the team in sacks with 5. And this team is a team that's got 21 sacks on the year, so they can get after the quarterback. They're able to put pressure on with their not only with their front line, but they're willing to bring other people into the mix. Miles Brandt actually is tied for second in sacks, and he's also a defensive back. So,
and one of the interior defensive linemen by the name of Greg Gaines is one of those just kind of is going to clog the interior, and for an offensive line with Ohio State, we're not sure Thayer Munford if he's a go, if Josh Alabi's if he's fully prepared, and the Ohio State offensive line has not been overly consistent throughout the course of the season, going up against not only an interior defensive lineman like Greg Gaines, as you mentioned, the defensive backs, the blitzing, and they've got a linebacker by the name of Ben Kervin, who led the entire country in tackles. He averages over 10 tackles a game. I was looking at kind of some of the defensive stats. He's not the biggest guy in the world. It's 6 foot, 220 pounds ish. He's one of those guys that excels at the college level, might be a man without a position at the NFL level. That's not to say that he won't play in the NFL, but he might have to play in the right team with the right scheme to have a pro career. But he is going to be a guy that should be around the ball a lot in the Rose Bowl.
Yeah, good linebackers. Burke Irvin and Bartlett get after you. They whenever you see a defense where the linebackers get tons of tackles, it's because the defensive line is doing a good job in keeping them clean.
Certainly. And that's something that I think, you mentioned Ohio State. All they have to do is just play soundly. I think that's probably the highest compliment I can give to Washington going into this, is that they play soundly every time.
Yeah, very good. Going to be very difficult to break them down. They're not going to fall for a lot of tricks. They're very well coached. And for all that we heard about Michigan's defense, I expect a lot more out of Washington's defense than we saw from the Wolverines.
Yes, and I am going to equate this game. My early prediction is this game is gonna feel like, in some way, shape, or form, kind of like the Big Ten championship game, kind of, like that kind of like pesky Northwestern, like get away, like stop it, that kind. That's my early thoughts on Washington. Is that's what this is going to be like for Ohio State.
Yeah, I think that Washington's defense possibly will be more like Michigan State.
Okay.
In terms of being able to get off the field. But I don't necessarily think Ohio State will struggle offensively to the point that they did against Michigan State. But because I just think that the team took a big step forward after that game. But I think this could be one of those games where the defense is annoyingly able to get you into a 4th and 1 rather than give up that first down. So that you're maybe punting from your own 40 rather than going for it, kind of in that if we were just 10 yards further down the field, we'd go for it, but we're not, so we won't kind of situation.
Yeah. And I know, we want touchdowns, but I think this is going to be the kind of game that Ohio State, when they can get points, take them. Mm-hmm. Like you said, they make a lot of teams settle for field goals, and I want touchdowns just as much as anybody, but don't let pride get in the way of points on the scoreboard. Blake Hobbiel may be a busier guy than Ohio State fans anticipated, and this might be a game of field position. So somewhere Jim Tressel might be in Youngstown might be smiling. This might turn into a game of field position and capitalizing on mistakes.
Yeah. So you started to make predictions about the way that the game will unfold. Why don't we go ahead and get your score prediction?
Oh, this is one where I believe the odds makers have Ohio State as about 6.5 point favorite as we're recording this, maybe give or take. And Ohio State. I think you referenced how Washington usually only allows about 16 points a game, and Washington's scoring about 26 points a game. I believe you're correct. I think we're going to see a long Gaskin run, which is going to make us angry, but it's going to certainly be food for thought for Greg Schiano if that uncomfortable conversation with Ryan Day takes place after the game. I think this is going to be close well into the fourth quarter, kind of like that Big Ten championship game against Northwestern I referenced a few moments ago. You brought up the Michigan State game. I think that's a good analogy. I think Ohio State comes out on top. I say Ohio State rings in 2019 with a 42-28 triumph in the Rose Bowl.
Wow. High scoring for these, for this defense, not these defenses.
Yes.
I'm actually not too far off from what you're thinking is. I do think Myles Gaskin will put together some annoying runs that, we've seen in the past. He's a talented guy. He's going to play at the next level, I think. And Washington does have some decent size on the offensive line. I think that Ohio State has to have a big game from Chase Young and Draymond Jones to force Jake Browning to make split-second decisions, because he's shown an inability to do that at times, or to make the wrong one, or to make the weird, why are you doing that throw back across the middle when you're running to your right late in the play kind of thing that results in interceptions and turnovers and that kind of thing, or as Jim Tressel would say, and so forth.
Exactly.
I've got Ohio State 35-28, and that I'd actually already written that down before you said 42-28. So because I'm old and I forget things, so I like to write them down so that I can reference them later. But I wrote it down when we started the show, and I think that this will be a game where Ohio State and Washington sort of go back and forth, and there's nobody really able to run away from the other team. It's going to be an emotional game, and especially I think in the fourth quarter for Ohio State, knowing that this is it for Urban Meyer, and I think Urban Meyer will probably see a lot of emotion out of him on January 1st. I
certainly agree with that, and I think when it comes down to it, the reason why I went with that 42 is as I just kind of was thinking about how Ohio State and Northwestern, the way that they were playing, it was kind of that annoying, can't really get too much going kind of a thing until late in the game. Ohio State was able to kind of get it to where they wanted it to be. That's kind of where I was thinking is it'll be close, and then either capitalizing on a Washington mistake, or maybe Mike Weber has some solid runs that kind of seals the deal for Ohio State. But I certainly agree that I think the emotion of this game is going to be what's going to propel Ohio State forward over Washington going into 2019.
Yeah. All right, Chip. We will see how it plays out on New Year's Day. We'll have to come back and do a wrap-up show, wrap up the season after this. You and I never did have a discussion of what we were going to do moving forward with Silver Bullets in the off season, but that's something that you and I can do off the air, and maybe it's something where we do one every 2 or 3 weeks just to keep up with the latest, because this is going to be an off season of noteworthy events. I think that we'll see some coaching turnover. Certainly, Ohio State needs to round out its recruiting class, but there's going to be things for us to talk about this off season where we might not quite have as much in the middle of a normal off season.
I certainly agree with you, and I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of direction the Ohio State football program takes beginning January 2nd.
Yeah. All right, that'll do it for this episode of the Silver Bullets podcast. We want to wish all of our listeners a very happy and very safe New Year. Take care of yourself. You want to be around on the 1st to see the Rose Bowl. And thanks for listening all year. This has been my first year with the Silver Bullets podcast, and I really thank everybody who's been supportive and everybody who's listened to this podcast and has not complained about it.
Certainly, it's been a wonderful year, and as you said a few moments ago, and I agree with you, I think figuring out what we're going to do in the off season. But I'm certainly looking forward to working with you because it's been an enjoyable 2018. I'm certainly looking forward to working with you into 2019.
And me as well. I've enjoyed working with you on this podcast, Chip. It's been fun for me, and I'm having a good time. So as long as I'm having a good time, we'll keep coming back for more. So thanks, everyone. We'll be back next week to talk about the Rose Bowl. And I guess there's nothing left to do now but to sign off the way we usually do. Go Bucks!
Go Bucks!